So I said it is both gift and problem to stand up here on Thursday afternoon because lots of people have said things that I would have said earlier in the week. So sort of the calculation for me has been about sort of what unique space do I inhabit in this conversation, and what might I contribute to helping us move it forward a little bit. So as Eric said, the topic of my talk today is from recipients of hospitality to bearers of gifts, because I think it's a really important shift to make. But before I go into that, I want to say a couple things. First of all, I'm incredibly grateful for each of you and for all the learning that happens in the room, and for folks who have been companions on this journey with me and for me for a long time, who are here, and also for folks that I'm just meeting this week. I was over here talking to Jessica Mathis, who came to the Institute from Savannah, Georgia, and she came and apologized that she had to leave, and I said, "It's because I'm getting ready to speak, right?" And she said, "No, I need to head back to Savannah, but I wanted to tell you that this experience changed my life." And I got Jessica's permission to tell you all that. And I said, "Jessica, say more to me about how this changed your life." And she said, "For a long time, I thought I was the only one thinking these things." So I think one of the things that being a member of this community does is it helps us say, "Me too," right? Like, I think these things and I'm not alone. I think that's a really great thing. Let me just move this a second, and then I'll get into my talk. So as I think about sort of moving from the idea of recipients of hospitality to bearers of gifts, the thing you need to know about me, the thing that would be the most important thing that you could help me do is to live into what my gift is, right? And I'll tell you what my gift is. My gift is that I love to cross boundaries and connect people who should know one another, right? So my time here at Georgia State, and before that, my time in the community working with the Interfaith Disability Network was really about connecting people who were doing good work who should know each other, because none of us should have to do this alone, right? And so, and I learned about what my core gift was, what the gift I most needed to give the world was from a man named Bruce Anderson, who's with community activators in Vashon, Washington. And Bruce has a core gift process that he takes people through. And I learned what my core gift was primarily because because of the process I went through with Bruce. But I also learned that the gift I need to give the world most for me is really connected to some pain that I have experienced in my life, right? So I grew up in a really conservative Christian church where my pastor was intent on praying for me to be cured of cerebral palsy every week at the end of the service. And yeah, that's pretty funny. Anyway, sorry. My gift is not that I'm not distractible, clearly. So essentially what would happen in my church is that at the end of the service, I would get called to the altar, and this pastor would sort of pray for me for an extended period of time, and was literally praying that I would be cured of the effects of cerebral palsy on that I experienced. And first of all, that got to be really tiresome. But second of all, like it's just a really interesting thing to me, and something that was said earlier in the week by Don Pollard that really resonates with me is that part of the reason that congregations, part of the reasons that faith groups have a problem with disability in their midst is it really messes with their categories, right? It's really hard for them to sort of have a coherent systematic theology in the face of difference, right? And so I think it's important to say that. And then from there, just to go back a second to say, what I realized in the context of sort of my journey through my church experience and through being really angry with God and through sort of working that out in the midst of a community that loved and supported me was that I could experience healing in my life, and it didn't mean that I had to be cured of my disability. And so what that means for me specifically is it's about living in a community of love and acceptance, and it's about living in a community that values me for what I bring, and values me for the gift and the gifts that I bring. And for me, that fundamentally is about more than we will make a space for you to sit in the back of the church or in the front of the church or in the middle of the church. Fundamentally, for me, that is about opening up a conversation about what it is God has called me to the community to give, right? To say it is not enough to be included because, and it is not enough to sort of seek inclusion for me. It is important to say, I have a gift that the community needs. I have a gift that I have been called here to give and that no one else can give unless I give it. But the community has to receive it, right? And so, this is what I'm talking about when I talk about sort of moving from this idea of inclusion and access. These things are important. They're important constructs in the conversation. But I said in a rather colorful way in a meeting last night, from my perspective, people with disabilities don't just want to be on the bus anymore. They want to be driving the bus. And if they can't, and they may need some support driving the bus. They may need accommodation driving the bus. They may need someone to help drive the bus. But we want to sort of be in the front of the room and have important contributions to make and not be simply recipients of charity, right? So I think that's an important thing for me to say in the beginning. And the grace of the work that I have been able to do here in Atlanta for the last 12 or 15 years has been that I have met some incredible people with disabilities. And the communities that help them belong the best are the communities that are good at giving them something to do. You know you're welcome in a place, in my estimation, when people trust you to do the work of the community, right? If people don't trust you to do the work of the community, you don't belong there yet. Does that make sense? And so I'm just going to tell you a couple of stories from my experience, and then talk about sort of a biblical model. And because of Julia Watts-Belser reminding me during her lecture at Emory of the power of poetry to move us to action, I'm going to share a poem with you at the end. So the first person I want to talk to you about is my friend Betty Thompson. Betty Thompson is a woman who lives in Decatur, Georgia, and she rolls about in the community, in the Oakhurst community, and everyone knows Betty. She is an amazing person, and I have had the opportunity to get to know her over the course of quite a few years. And I will tell you that the gift that Betty brings to her community is that she's a connector, right? She is so good at bringing people together to get work done. Now, if you were to meet Betty, you might at first wonder how it is she gives this gift, because she has significant cerebral palsy, uses a wheelchair, uses a letterboard to communicate. She doesn't use spoken language, but she is a brilliant lady. And I know that because I've had the privilege of taking the time to get to know her, and of getting to know her story, and getting to know how powerful she was at organizing people, at connecting people to get stuff done. So I've been working at Betty's church with the community there for a number of years, and Betty came to a meeting and said, so every Sunday morning when my attendant drives me, or when my caregiver drives me up to the back door, I have to wait for someone else to come to church to open the door for me. She said, wouldn't it be great if there was a button on the door that I could roll up and push so that I didn't have to wait for someone else to let me in? Now, have you ever worked in a church? Have you ever attended all the meetings that it takes to get something like that done? I'm sure that doesn't happen in synagogues, Shelley, right? It's particular to churches. But I'll tell you, what my friend Betty did, first of all, she said to the pastor, Lanny Peters, on the day we dedicate the automatic door, I will dance in the aisle, and I will hug everyone on their way out of this church, because that's how much it will mean to me when this gets done. And so she cast that vision, like, okay, I'm going to show up because I want to see her dance. I want to see what that's like. This is a Baptist church. Are they cool with that? And so what Betty did was, frankly, she showed up. So the Woody Allen quote, right? 80% of life is showing up. Betty showed up at lots and lots of meetings. And she answered lots and lots of questions. And she figured out who she needed to send the next email to. Betty is really good at using her computer to send email. She figured out who she needed to send the next email to say, how are we doing with this? Is there anything I can do to help? Is there someone else we need to have in the conversation who's not here? I was at Oakhurst Baptist Church the day the church dedicated the automatic door, and Betty did indeed dance in the aisle and hug every person in that church on their way out. It was an amazing experience, because the folks in the church came to realize that she was an organizer. She's not just a person with a disability who wants to come to church. She's an organizer. Like, she gets this stuff done. And that was really important for folks to realize. My colleague Stacy Ramirez, who you met here, some of you met here on Monday, or Tuesday, not Monday, on Tuesday, who did the workshop on person-centered planning, met with a group with Betty, and they did a path for Betty. And her supporters around the path were members of her church. And Betty said, the North Star on Betty's path, she said, I want to go visit the redwood forests in California. And when they asked her why she wanted to do that, she said, my father has passed away, but when I was young, he used to tell me stories about how beautiful the redwoods were, and I want to see them. And so, once again, Betty began to organize, right? She had a goal in her mind, and she began to organize. And last summer, a group from the congregation supported her. They flew out to LAX, rented 2 vans, and drove up the California coast. And it was amazing to see the pictures and see how much joy was in Betty's face and in her eyes in the pictures. And it was amazing. The stories that she has now are phenomenal. And it is all because a congregation said, we realize that there's a person here with tremendous gifts to help us do the work we're called to do. And we can't do what we're called to do here if we don't engage her, right? So the second story I want to talk to you about is a story of a Muslim friend of mine whose name was Karia Faiz, and she's passed away a couple of years ago. But Karia was the most amazing cultural broker I have ever known in my life. When I first started working at the Atlanta Masjid of Al-Islam, I was this 25-year-old, pretty much fresh out of seminary kid, and she took me under her wing. And she introduced me to her imam, and she was amazing. And Kyria didn't have a disability at the time, but what she said, and actually Bill and some other folks from the National Council of Churches Committee on Disabilities heard this story. What she said was, this work around disability in my community has been amazing. The community has come to recognize that mostly the women in the community who are advocating for the inclusion of people with disabilities, the community has come to realize that those women have gifts for leadership because we have been advocates in this conversation. And the rest of the community is coming to realize that we have other gifts to give as well. And so, just another story about, whether you have a disability or not, it isn't just about creating space for you to be present. It's about creating space for you and me and all of us to give the gifts that we've been given and to have them be received. So I want to just do this is one of my favorite things to do, but I just want to do so before I do that, I should say this. Yesterday, in the closing meditation, Shelley and Rabbi Belser talked about the call of Moses, right? And so I usually love to talk about the call of Moses, as Shelley highlighted yesterday in the meditation, because it is an example for me of God making an accommodation to make leadership possible, right? So I think that's incredibly profound. But I want to say that I sat in the back of lots of churches for lots of years and heard the healing stories in the New Testament read in lots and lots of ways that were very hurtful to me, that excluded me, and that made my participation in community hard. I didn't hear my story there, right? And so one of the things I began to do was to think about, what does it mean to move people with disabilities, the characters with disabilities in these stories, from objects of healing to subjects of their own stories, right? I'm hoping you're seeing a tie there, right? So the thing is, I think in these conversations, we really want to talk about how people with disabilities and all manner of disabilities want to be subjects of their own stories, right? We don't want to have ministry done to us. We would love to participate in a community that loves and accepts us and receives our gifts. And so, I'm going to read you a story from my tradition, the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 10, verses 46 to 52. It's my gospel. No, just a joke, really, seriously. So, How many of you are familiar with this story? Quite a few of you, right? I was talking to Bethany McKinney, and she was like, I love that story. So I thought, oh, okay, we'll use it. It's good. So the story starts, they came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more, saying to him, take heart, get up, he is calling to you. Oh, sorry. So Jesus stood still and said, call him here. And they called the blind man, saying to him, take heart, get up, he is calling you. So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, what do you want me to do for you? The blind man said to him, my teacher, let me see again. Jesus said to him, go forth, your faith has made you well. Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. So, how many of you have heard that particular passage read in your church on Sunday? Okay. And so I'm going to tell you some things that I know about this story because I am interested in trying to make Bartimaeus the subject of the story rather than the object of Jesus' healing. Okay? So in first century Palestine, if you were blind, you had no choice but to be a beggar, right? We didn't have Project Search in first century Palestine or post-secondary options for, inclusive post-secondary options for education. So people who had disabilities had few choices. And they certainly, so they certainly weren't included in the community. And so Bartimaeus is sitting by the side of the road, and he's got his cloak out in front of him, and people are putting money that they would give to him on his cloak. And one of the most important things I think about this story is where it says, first of all, that I always ask the question, what do you think about Bartimaeus makes him a particularly good leader? What would make him an important member of your community? Do you have any ideas? What would make Bartimaeus an important member of your community? Bold. He's bold. Yeah, is that a gift we need? People who are bold? What else? He looks to Jesus, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the story, it says he becomes a disciple, essentially. He follows Jesus on the way, right? What else? He pays attention to his environment. Yeah. He knows what's going on, right? He notices people. He doesn't give up. He doesn't give up. What else? He can articulate what he needs. Yeah, from the perspective of Jesus in this story, it's really kind of interesting because Jesus doesn't say, I know what you need. Jesus says, what is it you want? What is it I can do, right? He doesn't presume to know the answer before he asks the question, right? That's powerful. What else? Are there other things that would make him a particularly good member of your community? He's persistent. Yeah. So people are trying to tell him to be quiet, and he refuses to do it, right? I would argue that one of the gifts Bartimaeus gives his community is that he refuses to get out of the way. He is in the way, and he is loud. He knows what he needs, and he's going to see Jesus because he believes that Jesus can, this encounter with Jesus is going to change him, right? And you know how I know that? I know that because he left his cloak by the side of the road. That's all this man has almost no possessions, and he left his cloak on the side of the road, right? So he's faithful, right? Because he expects to be changed in the encounter. So, but I do want to say something about the virtue of being in the way, right? So, I take it as a compliment a lot when people say, Mark gets in good trouble, right? Mark likes to be in places where there's good trouble being stirred up. I think there's some good trouble that's been stirred up in this room this week so far, and I will promise you that there will be more. So what I want to invite you to do is to begin to think about being in the way as being a gift, right? So we've heard lots and lots of conversation this week about sort of how you get things done with pastors who are not responsive, and how you sort of massage conversations about inclusion. And I really appreciated the conversation this morning about, let's stop being apologetic about it. Like, the part of the issue is that congregations, when they asked for the exemption under the ADA 25 years ago, didn't do that so they could do nothing for the next 25 years, right? So I really do believe that we have to engage our conversations in conversations about not only that people with disabilities need spaces and places and communities that are safe, where people know their names, where people know their stories, where people miss them when they don't come. I want to be a part of a community where someone will call my house if I don't show up, right? Because that keeps me safe. Do you all want that? Do you need that from communities? If you don't show up, is there someone who will call your house? Yeah. So I think it's important to say that being in the way can be a good thing. That being in the way can be a gift. And Bartimaeus knew how to be in the way in a way that was really impactful and powerful and unapologetic, right? He knew how to ask for what he needed and expect that it was going to happen. Now, I'm not saying that you should call ADAPT to come and do an action at your church because the front entrance isn't accessible. But I am saying that it is important to be in a position to be able to ask for what you need and to expect that people will respond. And for me, there's a little bit of this talk as self-persuasion, right? So if I'm to tell my own story, I don't want to bother people. I don't want to ask for more than I need. But because I'm generally like that in the world, I want people to trust that when I ask for what I need, it's a real thing, right? I want people to trust that when I ask for what I need, that it's something that I really do need and something that I wouldn't be asking for if I didn't need the assistance with it. I think that's important, and I think for lots of people with disabilities, this idea that our presence is a inconvenience sometimes, it's pervasive, but it's about internalized ableism, right? Like, my body is the way it is, and the issue for me is that my community needs to be more accommodating to my body. The issue for people with developmental and intellectual disabilities, folks with autism, is that their minds are different, and we need to live in a community that accepts all kinds of minds. And so And that isn't to say that disability isn't a bodily experience, but from a justice framework, we have to take seriously this idea that that what is disabling the most is a society that doesn't meet our needs, right? So I sort of want to push on that to say, I think there are lots of hopeful and fruitful models of ministry with people with disabilities and for people with disabilities. And I think we're sort of moving, we're progressing, we're making progress in thinking about sort of what a generation of people with disabilities post-ADA require of us, right? So it isn't simply that, the church was doing this thing or the synagogue was doing this thing, and now people with disabilities are asking for something different. But it is that now people with disabilities have come of age with expectations that the communities they inhabit are going to be places where they can find what they need, where they can be home and safe and be in loving relationships. And so we, as people with disabilities, expect that of our congregations too, right? I know that means our congregations have a ton of work to do, and I'm grateful for everything everybody in this room is doing already. But I do want to say, sort of as a person with a disability, that it is really important to continue to privilege the voices and experiences of people who have this life, who have this experience. We've talked a lot about listening and the value of stories in the context of this. And in my experience, it doesn't take very long listening to people with disabilities before you hear them say something to the effect of, my congregation just doesn't get it. And so I want to live in a world where we don't have to say that anymore. Does that make sense? And so, in the spirit of doing something Rabbi Watts-Belzer taught me to do when she was at Candler, I want to put the text of my tradition that I read you earlier in conversation with a poem by Laura Hershey called In the Way. Do you know this poem? How many of you? This is my gift to you. Could you move, the waitress says, politely of course, you're in the way. A common request, my trusted wheelchair, just an impediment, an obstacle to the busy, a clumsy roadblock I haul with me down every road, and when parked, an interruption, or at least a slowing down, of the life I only wish to be a part of, a piece of surplus furniture in the already crowded rooms of restaurants, bars, and theaters. Usually I accommodate, backing into corners, turning sideways, angling my wheels to leave a clear path, asking politely, of course, is that better? I get in the way without trying. I apologize, excuse myself, and move out of the way. But not today. Today, I listen to a small, recalcitrant voice inside that insists such power should not be wasted. If I alone can be so much and so often in the way, if I can create such worry among wait persons, such consternation in concert halls, such alarm in the aisles of grocery stores, just imagine the aggravation a dozen or 24 or 300 people using wheelchairs can cause people who'd rather not see our needs or hear our demands or acknowledge our rights. Just imagine. Better yet, see me now. See me block this doorway, plant my wheels firm, See me lock my brakes? No, I tell some bureaucrat who wants to get into his office so he can make decisions about my future. No, I will not turn. I will not move over. I will not get out of the way. Not until the police order me to, under threat of arrest, and maybe not even then. In the way, all day. I, woman, this barricade which is mine, whenever I need it. This roadblock I haul with me down every road. This wall I can construct at will, and be happily in the way with, and say no with, and plaster with scrawled signs about freedom, and add to the bigger walls growing around whole buildings, around whole city blocks. I can turn back customers, employees, delivery people, even cops. I can keep the usually powerful in or out of their offices. I can be in the way. I can be in the way, my way. So I think that it's important to think about some ways of being in the way. Because I think my challenge to you today is to go back and be in the way where you are. So I think that inviting clergy people into conversations, inviting them to tell stories about why this work matters in their tradition, and then being really clear about what you expect from them is one way of being in the way. I think that it is really important to build coalitions with other people who care about the things you care about, so that you don't have to go back and think, I can't wait till Summer Institute next year so I can be with those people who are doing the work I'm doing. We need all of the 170 or 180 of you to continue doing the work you're doing in your congregations and communities, and to refuse to hear that it's not possible, that there's not enough money, that this isn't a priority for the congregation. And I think there's a way to be in the way faithfully, right? I think there's a way to be in the way faithfully. And that is to say that this is the work God calls us to. And I think there are some people with the gift of gentleness in these conversations. Maybe I clearly need to be allied with some of them. But it is important to say to ourselves, what are the gifts of the people who sit around us every Friday, every Saturday, every Sunday, and how can we work together to make our community what it's supposed to be, what it ought to be, what God calls it to be? So my challenge to you is to go back to your congregations and your communities and your seminaries and find people to be in these conversations with. Find allies who balance you, and look for allies in places where you wouldn't expect to find them, right? So I think there are a number of sort of trends in our community that we need to pay attention to as we have these conversations, as we do this work. One is, I think that, there's an opportunity because of some work that's going on in communities with veterans to ally ourselves with veterans groups around some access issues. There's some work going on here in terms of helping veterans reconnect with congregations, I think that's important. My teacher and mentor, Nancy Eastland, used to say that if you aren't a person with a disability yet, just wait. The reality is, every one of us will experience a disability at some point in our life, whether it be temporary or permanent. And so, people who don't have disabilities yet need to be your allies as well, right? Need to be my allies as well. And we can talk to them about how it's in their own self-interest to build communities where they will be welcome when they become people with disabilities, right? The other thing I think is important, and I really appreciate Barbara Newman's work around this for a number of years now, is thinking about the implications of the rise in diagnosis of autism for our congregations. And to not focus, to really focus our effort on understanding the spectrum of autism. To not assume that because you've met one person with autism, you know all people with autism. But to assume that because you've met one person with autism, you know one person with autism and the things that they could teach you. So, the thing I will say, as I close, because I have been long-winded, is to say, I think it's really important to engage people with disabilities in the beginning in this conversation, right? Because they may have gifts to help you get the work done. They may have stories that can compel leaders to act and to move in a way that you can't. But as I was talking about the gifts that we all possess, and knowing my own gift, and knowing that each one of you has a gift to give in the context of the congregation, please don't assume that every person with a disability wants to work on the Access Committee. Please don't assume that every parent wants to work on the Access Committee. You know what? Because parents and self-advocates get really tired of having to fight in the world, at the school, in the community. They would probably like for someone who is not them to fight the fight in the church or the synagogue or the mosque. And so, I think it's important to enter into these conversations, right? And to be honest about where you're headed and what you need to get that done. I'm really grateful to be able to do this and to talk to you guys today. It is incredibly humbling for me in a really, really serious way. Folks like Bill and Hans and John have been people that I have admired from afar for a long time, so that the idea that I might share this stage with them and have anything of value to say in the conversation is incredibly humbling to me. So I'm really grateful. We have some time, a few minutes, so I'd like to take questions or conversation. Thanks.